We're here with Ramaaya Salgado, Head of Office at UN Women Sri Lanka, and Esther Hoole, Gender Coordination Officer at UN Women Sri Lanka, to discuss the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Ramaaya has over 15 years of experience in international development, specializing in women's rights and gender equality. Her work has a special focus on governance, peace and security issues. Esther is a researcher, lawyer and development professional whose work centers around furthering gender equality, particularly with regards to policy reforms and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Welcome Ramaaya and Esther. I have a question for Ramaaya first. How represented are women in Sri Lanka in terms of governance and peace building, and why is this important?
So in terms of governance and in relation to politics in particular, I think women have been very poorly represented. Ever since Sri Lanka became a republic, I don't think we've ever been more than 7% in parliament at national level. And this is kind of an anomaly for a country that produced the world's first ever female prime minister. In terms of peace building, Sri Lanka has always had formal and informal processes and systems in place. And in the informal, you'll find women, very prominent women-led civil society and movements, but in the formal, less so. You don't see women in decision-making roles, etc.
I see, thank you. Early this year, Sri Lanka adopted the first national plan on women, peace and security. Could you tell us about the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
So in 2000, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1325, recognizing that despite centuries of conflict, this was the first time they actually recognized, in fact, that conflict and crisis impact women and girls differently. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda really is placing or recognizing the adverse impacts that conflict and crisis have on women and girls, firstly, but also recognizing their role in times of peace. To ensure social cohesion within communities, to ensure non-recurrence, and to support the relief and recovery in a post-conflict kind of situation. Conflict and crisis can be in times of political instability, economic instability, climate crisis, or even during a health crisis. It effectively advocates for the protection and prevention of conflict, participation of women in recovery and relief, and basically that no decision should be made for women and girls without the effective participation.
Thank you. Esther, could you help us understand why it's relevant to Sri Lanka right now?
So the Women, Peace and Security agenda is relevant in any context of conflict or crisis. And Sri Lanka, since independence, has unfortunately been trapped in cycles of violence and conflict, including prolonged armed conflict. And that is the relevance. But it's not, so there is that continuing relevance to our past. For example, if you look at the legacies of our past, even today we see, for example, women, mothers and wives of the disappeared and the dead, at the same time leading the struggle for accountability and answers and heading households for the first time. We see women who were affected by conflict-related violence struggling to access justice as well as access to support, including mental health support, which is a huge issue. And those are legacies of our past. But it's also relevant to our present and our future. We know that globally we're on the cusp of an economic recession. We also know that we've already begun to head into a climate disaster. And in Sri Lanka, we've started to feel both of those. We are in the middle of an intensive economic crisis. We are also beginning to feel firsthand the effects of climate change. And we know that all of these crises also in the past have affected and caused conflict, violence, and we can see that unfortunately as a constant threat. And in this context, across Sri Lanka's past, present and future, women have, despite being more than 50% of the population, never really been integrated into leadership, into finding solutions for this, into leading those solutions.
Thank you. Ramaaya, the National Action Plan must have been a layered and complicated process. Could you tell us how it was formulated?
You have acknowledged it took us almost 3 years to have the final sign-off on it before it was submitted to Cabinet earlier this year. Recently presented the process as a best practice in the region for Asia Pacific. This was a widely consultative process. So we went across the 9 provinces, 25 districts, recognizing that women, peace and security means different things to different people, and it has very nuanced differences across the country. And so we wanted to capture that in Sri Lanka's first ever National Action Plan. This was a process, of course, that was led by the Ministry of Women and Child Affairs with support from UN Women and the government of Japan. And the document, as we see it now, is based wholly on the consultations that came from the different stakeholders, national and subnational governments, civil society, UN and development partners, and most importantly by women and communities impacted by conflict. And then of course submitted to Parliament by the President himself, as he's the Cabinet Minister for this portfolio.
In what ways is this National Action Plan different from other policies on gender equality and women's empowerment? Esther, would you be able to give us some perspective?
So, national action plans and policies on gender equality are usually focused on protecting and empowering women and gender minorities with the final aim of achieving equality between the different genders. And that is a vital part of governance. It's important that we have that, and it's great that Sri Lanka does have that. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, and so this National Action Plan has broader objectives. It does look to achieving gender equality, but it is also aimed at ensuring peace and security. So in many ways, this is also an action plan on national security and one of our first public-facing documents on national security. Because the objectives of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and this National Action Plan are broader, the issues that it addresses are different. So for example, it addresses language justice. It addresses how we respond to climate disasters. It purports to strengthen national dialogue on peace and security, and these are broader than what you see in action plans on gender equality. At the same time, the people who are involved, the stakeholders that are involved are also different. Usually in action plans or policies on gender equality, you will see the Ministries of Women, of Justice, and a few of those stakeholders. But for this, for example, we have the Ministries of Defense and National Security closely involved, and they have to be involved in any process on women, peace and security because of those close links to peace, security and national security. And I think that's what's exciting about this National Action Plan, is that it addresses gender equality, but it also has those broader implications for how we as a country change.
Perhaps we can delve into this a bit more. Could each of you share some key interventions from the National Action Plan and why you think they're particularly important?
For me, I think one of the key interventions that I welcome really, or UN Women welcomes, where they have committed to expand the definitions of rape, where they have committed to gender parity in our forces, to look into personal laws that discriminate against women, but mostly that they have committed to protecting and serving impacted communities, mainly women, with a special focus on their livelihood, because we know in times of economic crisis like we are going through right now, women are probably one of the last people on the agenda to support, but they are more adversely impacted. So there is commitment, there's an entire chapter on economic empowerment, but with specific focus for women impacted by the conflict, so women heads of households, military widows, former combatants, and those directly impacted by the conflict in conflict-affected areas, to support their livelihood development and strengthen women's collectives.
There is a section that focuses on groups of women who are often the most forgotten and the most left behind. And within that, we have this focus on women heads of households, who make up 25% of our households in Sri Lanka, but are often completely forgotten. We have military widows, we have former women combatants who are attached to paramilitary groups. And again, these are the women who are at the heart of conflict, often most affected and still most forgotten. And it's important that the action plan has that focused section on supporting them, and there are interventions addressing their needs specifically. But there's also, for example, the beginning of Sri Lanka's gender responsive commitments on climate change. We know it's coming, and we know we have this influx of policies, but often again that nuanced impact on women is so quickly forgotten, and the fact that that's built into this action plan is really commendable. It's also really great to see the government's commitment on strengthening women's role in peace building. Like Ramaaya has already mentioned, we've had that legacy in Sri Lanka. We've had that for generations, but to see the government committing to it and committing to fostering that and strengthening that, recognizing the importance of it, that's really encouraging, especially when we move to a younger generation of peace builders.
Coming back to UN Women itself, can you tell us the UN Women's role in supporting the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Sri Lanka? Ramaaya?
Sure. I mean, globally, UN Women leads on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but specifically in the country we have supported the government of Sri Lanka to develop its national action plan, first ever national action plan on women, peace and security through financial and technical support. This is something we will continue to do as it rolls out the implementation plan. We'll look forward to coordinating with this government and non-government stakeholders, including civil society, development partners and the UN. We will also, acknowledging that anywhere in the world, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security doesn't always encompass all of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And quite often in countries, it's the civil society, mostly women-led civil societies, that take forward, the broader agenda and maybe some of the more nuanced work under the Women, Peace and Security agendas. UN Women will continue to work with such collectives and organizations, women human rights defenders, for example, to amplify and strengthen their voices in these processes, because historically they're the ones who have carried the weight of this work, for decades.
We need women-led civil society and women human rights defenders to be constantly integrated throughout the implementation. They have this legacy of having led the process for so long. They've fed into this action plan and they continue to be the link between government and communities of women. And if that link isn't maintained, then there's always a risk that this action plan will not achieve the change that it could achieve. And they must be formally integrated. There's always that informal link, but how well our systems integrate them formally, recognize them in leadership, that plays a huge role in how this is implemented. My second point would be that those who work on it, and that involves the Sri Lankan government, but also the development sector, including the United Nations, as well as civil society, that we work with sensitivity and that we work with accountability. We've had multiple processes and mechanisms on peace and security in Sri Lanka, and unfortunately many of them have re-traumatized or re-harmed women, despite the fact that these are women who've experienced the worst of our conflicts and crises. And we need to be sure that moving forward in implementing this action plan, that we walk softly, that we work with coordination, with capacity and competence, and that throughout it we remain accountable to the people that this action plan aims to empower and protect.
We have this year, had a rare show of political will in achieving gender equality in the country through the adoption of the National Policy on Women, through the adoption of the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, through the tabling of 3 bills on gender equality and women's empowerment, and through the up-and-coming development of the National Action Plan on Sexual Gender-Based Violence. These policies and frameworks are really important for the women and girls of the country, and if implemented well, then we're very likely to see results that we have all envisioned when developing these policy frameworks. But finally, just to say that we've had 75 years of policy and legislation development which has either been gender neutral or gender blind and has not taken into account the differential needs of women and girls of this country. And so if we are to stem this regression and move forward, then we really need to ensure that we keep women and girls at the center of all of this policy development and implementation as we go forward.
Thank you, Ramaaya and Esther, for joining us today and giving us a perspective on the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security. And we are looking forward to seeing how this progresses.
Thank you.
Thank you.